So this is a redo of an earlier video in which I went over the same questions but had an issue with the microphone. The wrong microphone was selected and the volume was therefore not right. It was too low. So I'm just going to do this again from the beginning. So Plato believed that he believed material objects to be crude representations of unseen ideal forms. Ideas, basically. In his view, such abstract, non-material forms are the ultimate source of knowledge. Aristotle disagreed, positing that knowledge is best obtained through direct engagement with the material world. Blank, sensory experience of the material is the ultimate source of knowledge. Okay, so what we want to hammer home as far as these transition word questions is the following. We want to think about how the different parts relate. Okay, so what they're doing here is I'm just going to say they're making a point. And I use this a lot to characterize the first part because it's pretty broad. They're making a point. Then what are they doing here? They're rewording the same point. Making a point and then rewording a point. In other words. So they're not drawing a conclusion, which we don't even see here. They are not making a contrast, which regardless would imply. And then admittedly, I've had some questions about that. Admittedly, well, that means basically you are admitting or granting or conceding some point. And we will actually see one later on that has granted as the correct answer. And again, both of these, granted, admittedly, I can't think of any others in this category, but I never saw these as correct answers on the paper SAT, but they do seem to be asking about them more. So again, we'll say more about this later when we encounter granted on one of the questions, but this one is in other words. That would be another more or less similar transition phrase. You're stating something and then you're rewording it. Magnetic levitation trains are suspended above a track by powerful electromagnets, reducing friction and thus allowing for much faster speeds. Though maglev advocates in the U.S. have long imagined these trains crisscrossing the country, their dream remains unrealized, so it has not become a reality. Blank, of the handful of maglev trains currently in operation, all are in Asia. Okay, so again, I'm going to say that the first sentence in our pair here is making a point. What is that point? That this dream of having magnetic levitation trains crisscrossing the country, that point is that it hasn't happened yet. And then our second sentence, what is our second sentence doing? We could say doubling down on or emphasizing that point. So it's not making a contrast. You might look at that and say, well, it's a contrast because one is talking about the United States and one is talking about Asia. A commenter said that in response to the previous version of this video, but that is not what we have here. We do not have a contrast. The first of these sentences, the sentence in red, is saying the dream of having these magnetic levitation trains in the U.S. remains unrealized, meaning there aren't a lot of those trains, or there aren't many of these trains. Trains don't crisscross the country. In fact, there aren't any. Of all the maglev trains currently in operation, all are in Asia. So it's emphasizing that point. So in fact or indeed. Indeed would be the other one that stands out in terms of signifying this relationship where you have a point and then you come back and emphasize it or double down on it, to use a slang term. You double down on it. I'd say more about indeed in another video, and I'll try to remember to link to it. But it's a College Board test that talks about a paper SAT that talks about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And I believe it's number 14 on that test. I can't remember if that's College Board Test 6. I think it is. Yeah. So anyway, we'll say more about it in that one, but indeed and in fact mean the same thing. That said, actually could go together with granted and admittedly. To that end, I talk about in the same video in which I talk about indeed. To that end means in order to achieve this goal, with this goal or objective or end in mind, they did this. Accordingly would be another one that kind of does the same thing as to that end. When one looks at the dark, craggy vistas in Hitoshi Fugo's evocative photo series, one's mind might wander off to the cratered surfaces of faraway planets. Blank, it's the series' title, I should really have an S there, flying frying pan that brings one back to Earth, reminding the viewer that each photo is actually a close-up view of a familiar household object, a frying pan. Okay, so this one I find hard to kind of characterize off, initially before looking at the answer choices. So I'll just go ahead and say that the correct answer is going to be ultimately Y. Well, what it's saying is, you might do this and you might think about that. You might wander off this way, but in the end, it's the series' title. So ultimately, in the end, again, these are words that I never saw as correct answers on the paper SAT, but that doesn't mean they were never used. It just means that they were never used in any of the released tests or any of the released tests that I've seen. But both of those mean essentially the same thing. It's not the same thing as finally. It's not quite the same thing as finally. Finally tends to be used when you have a sequence. First you do this, next you do that, then you do this other thing. Finally you take this last step. Ultimately is more like a stepping back. Again, in the end. I know it looks like finally, but it is a little bit different. Consequently would mean that we were drawing a conclusion. Additionally goes with moreover, furthermore, also, in addition. And then alternatively, well, that would mean that we had an alternative that was pointed out, and that's not what we have here. It's not saying that your mind might wander off here. Alternatively, it might wander off to this other place. No, it's saying it might wander off, but in the end, ultimately, it's the title that brings you back. Tulip mania, the rapid rise and sudden fall of the price of tulip bulbs in 17th century Amsterdam, is often cited as an example of the perils or dangers of rampant, overactive market speculation. However, recent research has demonstrated that the episode was neither as frenzied nor as disastrous as has been thought. The popular myth surrounding it, blank, should be regarded with some skepticism. Okay, so there is a transition word there, but we're not going to worry about that. We just care about this relationship. Not that. I don't want that. Recent research has demonstrated that the episode was neither as frenzied nor as disastrous has been thought. The popular myth surrounding it should be regarded with some skepticism. What is the relationship here? Well, I'd say that they're making a point, and then they are sort of drawing a conclusion from it, or an inference. So more of a conclusion. Or maybe you could say it's cause and effect. Recent research has demonstrated this. Because of this, the popular myth surrounding it should be regarded with some skepticism. Therefore, okay. Again, if you want to think cause and effect, or point and conclusion, or premise, conclusion, something like that, because of this, this is the case. So we do not have a contrast here, even though we did there. We're not giving an example, and then nevertheless indicates its own kind of contrast. Some bacteria have developed mechanisms for resisting antibiotics. Okay, so what are they doing here? They're making a generalization. Even though they're not saying all bacteria, they're saying some of them have done this. And then what are they doing here? They're giving an example. A specific example that well, exemplifies the generalization. So we don't have a contrast, we don't have a conclusion, and we're not talking about two things happening at the same time. Seismologists so-and-so have proposed that the magma fueling Iceland's more than 30 active volcano systems emerges from deep within Earth. The great depths involved, nearly 3,000 kilometers, mark Iceland's volcanoes as extreme outliers. No, that's not outliers, that's outliers. Outliers, a mathematical term. I talked about this more in the previous version, but something that is not like the others. Something that is not like the others. Okay, so for just briefly, if this was your data set, 15, 16, 17, 20, 21, and 99, okay, 99 would be an outlier. It's not like the others. Okay, the great depths involved, nearly 3,000 kilometers, mark Iceland's volcanoes as extreme outliers. Blank. Many of Earth's volcanoes are fed by shallow pockets of magma found less than 15 kilometers below the surface. And you might be tempted to pick a contrast word here, but read carefully and closely. The great depths involved mark these volcanoes as extreme outliers. So I'm going to do a little diagram using these lines as an aid here. So this is the surface. It's 0 kilometers below the surface. 1,000 kilometers below, 2,000 kilometers below, 3,000 kilometers below. Okay, so Iceland's volcanoes are way down here. Well, they're not quite there, but they're nearly there, nearly 3,000 kilometers. But they're unusual. Many of Earth's volcanoes are less than 15 kilometers below the surface. So what are they doing here? Again, it seems like they're drawing a contrast, but they're actually doing another example of what I'd call doubling down or amplifying the previous point. These are outliers. The fact that they're 3,000 kilometers makes them outliers. Indeed, many of Earth's volcanoes are found less than 15 kilometers. This is amplifying or emphasizing that previous point. What is that previous point? That being so far below the surface is unusual. They are outliers. So much so that many of these are right below the surface. So this is going to be indeed, I keep bumping my microphone, sorry. So again, indeed, in fact, we are taking the previous point and emphasizing it or amplifying it, magnifying it, doubling down, however you prefer to think about it. We're not drawing a conclusion here, we're not adding on, and most importantly in this case, we do not have a contrast. In a heated debate in biogeography, the field is divided between dispersalists and vicariancists, and they're not going to expect us to know those words. So they're going to tell us what those are. Blank, there are those who argue that dispersal is the most crucial determining factor, and those who insist that vicariance, or separation due to geographic barriers, is the most crucial. We don't need that. Okay. In a heated debate, okay, so what they're doing here is, okay, they're making a point. I'm going to say it's a somewhat obscure point in the sense that the average reader, and I'll include myself in that category, is not expected to know what those words mean. Okay, so what are they doing in the second sentence? They're coming back and clarifying or explaining, or to use a word that is popular in academia, they're unpacking that point. They're taking something that is dense and they're sort of spreading it out, kind of like you would unpack a suitcase. And so now you can see all of your clothes and belongings. Here they're unpacking the sentence so that, you know, they define these words, this word and that word. Okay, so that is. So that is, yeah, in other words, those would be the two main transitions that indicate that you're going to be rewording what was just stated in, again, hopefully in a clearer, easier to understand fashion. So we're not pointing out a similarity, we're not making a contrast, and we're not merely adding on. We are restating. With its cliched imagery of suburban lawns and power lines, John Ashbery's poem, Ignorance of the Law is No Excuse, may seem barren terrain for critical analysis. So they're making a point. Again, that generic characterization that I like to use. So it may seem barren. Barren terrain. Barren terrain would be something like the Arctic tundra, where you can't really grow things. Okay, it may seem that way. Cultural critic Lauren Berlant finds fertile ground in just its first two stanzas. So we could say it's a contrasting point. My voice squeaked there. We could say it's a contrasting point. It's a particular kind of contrast. It's saying, despite this, in spite of this, regardless, nonetheless. So nonetheless, regardless, nevertheless, even so. Despite this could even work. All of those are saying kind of, disregarding what is just, not just disregarding what has been said, but in spite of what has just been said. You could even get away with however. As I talk about in a video, like what's the difference between however and nevertheless? Yeah, there's a pretty strong overlap between the two. We're not rewording anything here. And then in turn would indicate steps in a sequence. I feel like I explained that well in the previous video, and it was inaudible. So you do these people. Let's say that we have a series of steps that are carried out in like a factory. Car. Let's say it's 1910, and we're in a car factory. The people over here make the. I don't know. They're working on the engine, and the people over here work on the body of the vehicle. I know that's pretty broad. And then in turn, they send it over here, and these people, supply the interior and the steering wheel or whatever. So they do this, then these people do that. In turn, these do the other. So it's kind of like you're taking your turn, like in a board game or any kind of game. You're taking your turn in turn. Never seen it as a correct answer, but could be at some point. A 2017 study of language learners, sign language learners, tested the role of iconicity. So don't expect you to know that word, but it's based on icon. Okay, iconicity, the similarity of a sign to the thing it represents in language acquisition. The study found that the greater the iconicity of a sign, the more likely it was to have been learned or acquired. Blank. The correlation between acquisition and iconicity was lower than that between acquisition and another factor studied, sign frequency. Okay, so here I'm going to do is make a little graph because we're talking about correlation. And so with correlation, well, you've got an x-axis and a y-axis. The greater iconicity, however that's measured, the greater the learning. So correlation doesn't mean it's exact, but we've got a bunch of data points, and we'd have a line of best fit that has a positive slope. So learning or acquisition there. Okay, so that's a positive correlation. I don't want to say a transition word. The correlation between acquisition and iconicity was lower than that between acquisition and another. So I'm just going to put learning for acquisition, the frequency. Okay, so what this is saying is that this is a stronger correlation, such that if we drew this line of best fit, it would be steeper than this line. I didn't quite get that the way I wanted it, but you get the idea. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, our correct answer is granted. And I thought this was a little bit strange, but again, remember that granted is going to mean the same thing as admittedly. And did I come up with one other one? That said, having said that said, why do they use this here? Well, they're granting or conceding that even though this is a relationship that exists is not as strong as some other one. So I feel like there could be a contrast. I mean, there's a kind of contrast. I feel like however would not be wrong here, so they couldn't really give you however. It's not to say that granted means the same thing as however, just that I think it would be possible to make an argument for either one of them, but we're not emphasizing a previous point. You know, if we wanted to use in fact here, our last sentence would need to say something like this. In fact, the correlation between acquisition and iconicity was even higher than that between acquisition and frequency. We would need to be emphasizing the fact that this is a strong relationship as opposed to sort of undercutting that or acknowledging, yeah, even though it's a strong relationship, this other thing is even stronger. So we're not rewording, we're not saying as a result, so we're just saying granted. And I think there's one more. Yes. When composing music for film, this composer typically uses traditional orchestral instrumentation blank. For the score of this film, he incorporated unorthodox digital instruments. Okay, so we have what is typically the case, and then what is the case here, and that's a contrast. He typically does things this way, but in this particular case, he's doing them this other way. We have a contrast, and that is that. However, nevertheless, could have also worked here. The important thing with a question like this is, you know, they could have had, for example, as an option, and it could have been very tempting to just say, oh, hey, that looks good. They're making a point, and then they're going to give an example. But you always want to remember that a transition is a transition from something to something else, kind of like a gift is from someone to someone else. And so you want to make sure that the transition word or phrase that you choose connects to both of them. You don't want to just read one and then say, oh, this sounds good, and assume. You want to make sure that you're testing. And so that's why on all of these you see or observe or hear me really focusing on the sentences and their relationship first before looking at the answer choices. You want to be thinking about the relationship, not just plugging in answers and seeing how they quote unquote sound to you. You don't want to do that because it's just not the most effective way to do these questions. Believe me, I've been doing this for a while. So think about the relationship, think about what kind of word needs to go in the blank, and you'll either guess the exact word or you might think of however, and it turns out to be nevertheless. You'll have the right idea. And so as long as you have these groupings of words that you know sort of cluster together, that's really going to be all you need. So study those transition words and make sure you know which ones are more or less equivalent to one another. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below.